Hollis Vance walked to the hillside that morning expecting to dig 2 graves. The wind had been screaming since before sunrise, the kind of wind that peels bark from fence posts and finds every gap in a shutter. 3 farms over, a horse had frozen standing up in its own stall. Nobody in the county had seen a night like it in longer than most of them had been alive. He was not walking to check on a house. He was walking to check on a hole in the ground. That was what they called it, after all. Not a home, not a shelter. A hole. Some had called it worse in the months before the storm, standing outside the church with their hats in their hands. They had called it her tomb. He remembered saying it himself once in October, when the ground was still soft enough to argue with. He had not meant it as cruelty. He had meant it as a warning. He had seen a hillside like that, one fold in on itself before, years back, with a man still inside it. Now his boots broke through a crust of ice at the base of the slope, and he stopped. There was no snow drifted against the door the way there should have been. No frost feathering the seams of the frame. And when he pressed his bare palm flat against the timber beside the entrance, he pulled it back like he had touched a stove. Somewhere behind that door, a woman and a boy who should not have survived the night were still asleep. Hollis did not knock right away. He stood there a moment longer, hand still warm, trying to understand what he was looking at. Because whatever she had done to that hillside, it was not what any of them had warned her about. And it was not luck either. Luck did not explain a wall that felt like this after a night that had killed a horse in its own barn. Something about that ground had been telling her something all along. Nobody had bothered to ask what. If you're watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where in the comments. Stories like this one survive because people still take the time to remember them. And if frontier ingenuity like this means something to you, stick around, there's more of it coming. The letter that gave Ruth Calloway the land was shorter than the one that had told her, 5 months earlier, that her husband was not coming home from the quarry. She read both of them at the same kitchen table. She folded both of them the same way, 3 times, before putting them in the drawer where he used to keep his level and his measuring stick. The land itself was 30 acres of thin soil and one steep hillside that nobody in the county had ever wanted. Not because it was poor ground, but because of what was already cut into it. A dugout, hollowed into the slope 2 generations back by a homesteading family whose name nobody quite remembered anymore. It had been empty for years, empty, and mostly avoided. People called it the tomb before Ruth ever set foot near it. Children dared each other to run up and touch the old doorframe. Old men mentioned it the way they mentioned bad luck in passing, without elaborating. Ruth did not have the luxury of avoiding it. She had one son, 7 years old, with a cough that worsened every time the temperature dropped, and a landlord back in town who wanted the house she was renting returned to him before the first snow. She had very little money, less time, and a hillside that was, whatever else it was, already half dug. Her brother-in-law, Garrett Calloway, came by twice that week, each time with the same offer. He would take the land off her hands, he said, for a fair price, and she and Eli could move into town, into something proper, something that did not have a name like that attached to it. Ruth thanked him and did not answer directly. That evening, she walked up the slope alone, her son's cough carrying faintly on the wind behind her, and she stood at the mouth of the old dugout for a long time before she ever stepped inside. What she saw was not a grave. It was a slope that faced the right direction, cut into a hill that blocked the worst of the wind, with walls of packed earth that felt, even in October, strangely mild against her palm. She did not know yet what that meant. She only knew that winter was coming faster than her son's lungs could wait for a better answer. By the following morning, she had already started carrying tools up the hill. The old dugout was too small, too low, and too badly shaped to hold 2 people through a real winter. Ruth understood that within the first hour of standing inside it with a lantern. The ceiling forced her to stoop. The single vent near the roofline was choked with old nesting material. The floor sloped the wrong way in one corner, toward the door instead of away from it, which meant that any water that found its way in would have nowhere to go, but toward whoever was sleeping there. She began widening it with a spade and a pickaxe that had belonged to her husband, working in the mornings while Eli slept later than he should have, exhausted from a cough that kept him up most nights. Hollis Vance found her there on the third day. He did not mock her. That would come later, from other people, in softer and crueler ways. What Hollis offered instead was a warning, delivered flatly, the way a man delivers something he wishes were not true. He told her about a hillside 2 counties over, years back, that had looked solid enough for a man named Abner Reyes to cut a shelter into it. The walls had held for 1 winter. In the second, after a wet spring had soaked the slope from above, they had folded inward without any warning at all. Reyes had been inside. Hollis was not being unkind. He was being specific, in the way of a man who had helped carry the aftermath. Ruth listened to the whole account without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him a single question. She asked where the water on that hillside had gone in the weeks before it failed. Hollis did not have an answer. Nobody had asked that question at the time. They had only asked whether the ground looked strong enough, and it had, right up until the moment it was not. Ruth thanked him for the story and kept working. She was not ignoring the warning. She was trying to figure out what question the warning was actually pointing toward, because as she cut further into the hillside that week, she began to notice something the old dugout had never been built to account for. The slope above the roofline was not flat. It carried water somewhere. Nobody in 2 generations had ever traced exactly where. By the end of that week, her hands were blistered. The opening was nearly twice its original size, and the first real autumn rain was already building somewhere out past the ridge. The rain arrived on a Thursday and did not stop for 2 days. Ruth had moved most of their belongings into the dugout by then, more out of necessity than confidence. The landlord in town had given her 1 final week. There was nowhere else for her and Eli to be. For the first several hours, the shelter held. The packed earth walls stayed dry. The new, wider opening let in enough gray daylight that Eli sat near it with the family Bible open on his knees, more interested in the sound of the rain than the words on the page. It was near midnight, with the rain still falling in sheets, that Ruth heard the sound she had been dreading without naming it, a slow, steady drip coming from the back corner of the dugout, the same corner where the floor had always sloped the wrong way. She followed the sound with the lantern and found a hairline crack running down the earthen wall, water already beading along its length and gathering at the base in a thin, dark line. Eli's cough picked up almost immediately, worsened by the sudden dampness in the air. Ruth spent the rest of that night packing wet cloth into the crack, moving their bedding to the driest corner she could find, and listening to the wind test every seam of the shelter she had spent a week building. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the damage had not. Word travels fast in a small community, and by the following afternoon, 3 separate neighbors had heard some version of the story. The widow's tomb was leaking. Some said flooding. One version, by the time it reached the general store, had the whole hillside on the verge of collapse. Garrett arrived that evening, not to gloat, but to make his offer again. Gentler this time, framed as concern for Eli rather than interest in the land. He mentioned, more than once, that a boy with weak lungs had no business sleeping somewhere damp enough to grow mold in its walls. Ruth did not have an answer for him yet. Standing in the drying mud with a lantern in one hand and her husband's old level in the other, she understood, for the first time, that digging deeper into the hill had never been the mistake. The mistake was somewhere above her, in ground she had not yet learned to read. Ivar Solberg had lived on the far side of the valley for nearly 40 years, ever since arriving from Norway as a young man, with almost nothing but a trunk of tools and a way of building that nobody in the county had asked him to teach. He came to see the crack for himself 2 days after the storm, walking the whole distance on a bad hip because, as he put it, some things were better understood in person than described secondhand. He did not laugh at the dugout. He did not call it a tomb. He walked around the outside of the hill for the better part of an hour, occasionally crouching to press a hand flat against the slope before he ever stepped through the door. When he finally spoke, it was not to Ruth's hands or her tools. It was to the hillside itself. He explained, in the plain and careful English of a man who had learned it as a second language, that the shelter had never failed because the earth was weak. Earth like that, packed and undisturbed for generations, could hold weight far longer than most people assumed. What it could not do was decide, on its own, where rainwater was allowed to go once it landed above the roofline. In his home country, he said, families who built into hillsides like this one had always cut a shallow channel above the shelter itself, angled to carry water sideways along the slope, instead of letting it settle down into the roof and walls. Without that channel, every hard rain would eventually find the same low point and follow it inside. Ruth had cut deeper into the hill. She had never redirected what came from above it. Ivar did not offer to fix it for her. He was too old for that kind of labor, and he said so without embarrassment. What he offered instead was a description, slow and specific, of where such a channel had always been placed in the shelters of his youth, and how its angle was chosen not by guesswork, but by watching where water already wanted to go before anyone dug a single shovelful. Ruth listened to all of it, while Eli coughed quietly behind her, wrapped in a blanket still damp at one corner. She thanked Ivar for walking all that way on a bad hip. Then she went back into the drawer where her husband's tools were kept, and took out the level she had not yet found a real use for. The next morning, Ruth did not touch the crack at all. Instead, she climbed to the top of the slope, above the roofline of the dugout, and began walking the ground the way Ivar had described, watching for the places where the earth already sat a little lower, a little more worn, where rain had clearly passed before without anyone ever choosing that path for it. She used her husband's level to check the pitch of the hillside in 3 different spots, laying it flat against the ground and reading the small bubble the way he had once shown her when he was still teaching her to hang shelves straight in their first house together. By midday, she had marked a line with a row of stones, angled away from the dugout entrance and running sideways along the slope toward a natural low point nearly 40 feet away, where a stand of dry brush already showed signs of old water damage. Digging the channel took the better part of 3 days. It was shallow work compared to hollowing the shelter itself, but it demanded a kind of patience Ruth had not needed before. Checking the angle again and again, correcting small mistakes as she found them, refusing to let the trench flatten out anywhere along its length. Eli, on days when his cough allowed it, sat nearby wrapped in blankets and handed her stones to mark the edge of the channel. It was not much help, in practical terms. It was enough to keep him close, and to keep her working with something other than fear driving her hands. Hollis passed by twice during those 3 days. He did not offer help, but he also did not offer another warning. He watched from the fence line for a while on the second afternoon, arms crossed, before walking on without a word. When the channel was finished, Ruth packed fresh earth back into the crack inside the dugout, using a heavier mixture this time, mixed with straw the way Ivar had suggested, and let it dry over 2 clear days. There was no proof yet that any of it worked. The sky stayed clear, almost mockingly so, as if daring her to believe she had solved anything at all. What she had, by the end of that week, was not certainty. It was a hillside that finally had somewhere to send its water, a repaired wall, and a level tucked back into her coat pocket instead of a drawer. The real test, she knew, was still out past the ridge, waiting on whatever the season decided to send next. The first hard frost came earlier than expected, nearly 3 weeks ahead of what most families in the valley considered normal. It arrived overnight, dropping the temperature well below freezing and coating every fence post and dry stalk of grass in a thin, silver crust by morning. 2 farms down the road, a family woke to find their water barrel cracked clean through. Ruth woke before dawn to check on Eli first, the way she always did, and found something she had not expected. The air inside the dugout was cool, but nowhere near as sharp as the air outside. The packed earth walls, which had felt merely mild in October, now held a faint, steady warmth against her palm. Nothing like a stove, but nothing like frozen ground either. Eli slept later than he had in weeks, and when he woke, his cough was quieter than it had been since the rain. Word of the frost spread quickly, along with comparisons. The Hendricks family, in a proper timber house 2 miles off, had woken to frost forming on the inside of their windows. Ruth and Eli, in a hillside some people still called a tomb, had woken to nothing worse than cool air and a dry floor. But the frost also revealed a problem nobody had accounted for. By mid-morning, a faint dampness had gathered along the ceiling near the vent, not dripping, but present enough to leave a dark ring in the earth overhead. Ruth pressed her hand to it and understood, slowly, that the same warmth keeping the walls mild was also holding on to moisture that had nowhere left to go. Now that the vent above the roofline was too narrow and too clogged with old debris to carry it out properly. The shelter was warmer than any house in the valley that morning. It was also, in its own quiet way, beginning to trap the very dampness that could someday do to their lungs what the cold alone had not managed to do. Ruth stood beneath that dark ring for a long moment, Eli's breathing steady behind her for the first time in weeks, and understood that surviving the cold and surviving the season were not, after all, quite the same problem. Garrett Calloway arrived 3 days later, not with an offer this time, but with a folded piece of paper and an expression Ruth had not seen from him before. He had spoken, he said, with a man in town who understood such things, about whether a widow with a sickly child had any business raising that boy in a hole cut into a hillside, especially one already rumored to be damp enough to rot a man's boots by December. The paper was not a legal notice. Not yet. It was, Garrett admitted when Ruth pressed him, a letter of concern he intended to bring before the county, framed around Eli's health rather than the land itself, should she refuse once more to sell. Ruth did not raise her voice. She had learned, in the 5 months since her husband's death, that grief did not leave much room left over for shouting. She asked Garrett, plainly, whether he had stood inside the shelter himself at any point since the frost, or whether he was speaking from what he had heard secondhand at the general store, the same place that had once described her home as flooding after a single hairline crack. Garrett admitted he had not gone inside. She invited him to. He stayed only a few minutes, arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable being there at all, but he touched the wall once, near the entrance, the way Hollis would later touch it on a far colder morning, and said nothing about it afterward. Before he left, he told her the offer to buy the land still stood, and that he hoped, for Eli's sake, she would reconsider before the deep winter arrived. Ruth thanked him for his concern, and did not promise anything in return. Standing in the doorway after he had gone, she allowed herself, for the first time since October, a small and uncomfortable thought. If the ceiling problem was not solved before real winter came, Garrett would not need a letter of concern at all. The valley would decide the matter for him. The news came by way of a traveling grain buyer who passed through in the second week of November, carrying reports from 3 counties over of an unusually early freeze settling in across the region. Old-timers in the valley began doing what old-timers do when a season starts behaving strangely. They started counting backward, comparing the current cold against winters they remembered from childhood, from their parents' stories, from whatever almanac or memory they trusted most. The number that eventually settled over the general store, repeated often enough that nobody bothered to question where it had first come from, was 52 years. Not since then, they said, had the region seen a freeze arrive this early, this hard, with rivers already skinning over with ice, while there was still unharvested grain standing in some fields. For most families, that number meant extra firewood, extra flour, extra worry about livestock. For Ruth, it meant something more specific. It meant that whatever problem still lived in that dark ring above the vent had very little time left to be solved by anything other than a real, sustained test. She spent the following week widening the vent itself, working carefully so as not to weaken the roofline, clearing out the old nesting debris Ivar had warned her about weeks earlier, and adding a second, smaller opening near the floor on the opposite wall, angled the way Ivar described, to let cooler air draw in low while the warmer, damper air found its way out high near the roof. She could not test whether it worked, not truly, not until the temperature dropped far enough and stayed there long enough to matter. Eli, wrapped in blankets by the fire one evening, asked her plainly whether the shelter would hold through a winter like the one everyone kept talking about. Ruth told him the truth, because she had decided months earlier that she would not lie to her son about things that might still hurt him. She told him she did not know. She told him she had done everything she understood how to do, and she told him that sometimes that had to be enough, right up until the moment it either was or it was not. Outside, the wind had already begun to shift, carrying the first real edge of the season none of them had chosen, but all of them would have to survive. The storm arrived on the 11th night of December, and it did not announce itself gently. For the first 2 hours, the shelter behaved exactly as it had during the frost. The walls held their faint warmth. The new vents drew air the way Ivar had described, low and cool coming in, warmer and damper air finding its way out near the roof. Eli slept through the worst of the early wind, curled against his mother's side, his breathing steady. Then, somewhere near midnight, the wind changed direction. It had been blowing from the west since the storm began, the same direction it had blown during the frost, during every test the shelter had faced so far. Without warning, it swung hard from the north, driving directly into the widened vent near the roofline, the one opening nobody had ever tested against wind coming from that particular angle. Ruth felt it before she understood it. A sudden cold current cutting across the ceiling, followed almost immediately by a thin, sharp whistle as the wind forced its way through the gap around the vent's edge. Eli woke coughing, harder than he had in weeks, curling forward against the sudden draft. Ruth was on her feet immediately, lantern in hand, trying to judge how bad the intrusion actually was. The vent itself was not failing. The wind had simply found an angle nobody had accounted for, an angle that turned a carefully placed opening into a funnel instead of a release. She had, as far as she could tell, 3 choices, and no time to weigh them slowly. She could pack the vent closed entirely and risk trapping the same damp air that had left that dark ring on the ceiling weeks earlier. She could leave it open and risk the cold finding its way deeper into the shelter with every gust. Or she could try something she had only half considered before, adjusting the covering over the opening itself rather than sealing it. angling a section of stiff hide to block the wind's direct path while still allowing air to pass around it. She had never tested that last option. She was not certain it would work at all. Eli's coughing was worsening by the minute, and outside, the wind showed no sign of settling before morning. Ruth chose the hide covering, not because she was confident, but because sealing the vent entirely felt, in that moment, like giving up ground she had spent 2 months earning. She worked quickly in the lantern light, cutting a stiff section of hide from a piece she had been saving for boot repairs and fastening it above the vent opening at an angle, propped just far enough from the earth to let air still slip around its edges while breaking the wind's direct path into the shelter. The whistling stopped almost immediately. The cold draft dulled to something manageable within minutes. Eli's coughing did not stop as quickly. It took the better part of an hour, wrapped tightly against his mother with a warm stone from near the hearth pressed against his chest, before his breathing settled into something closer to normal. Neither of them slept much for the rest of that night. Ruth sat awake beside her son, listening to the storm test every seam of the shelter she had built, adjusted, failed at, and rebuilt over the previous 2 months, with no way of knowing for certain whether the hide covering would hold until dawn. It held. By the time the wind finally began to ease, somewhere in the gray hour before sunrise, the walls around them were still faintly warm. The floor was still dry, and Eli was asleep, properly asleep, for the first time since midnight. Hollis Vance walked up that hillside a few hours later, expecting, as he would later admit, to find something considerably worse than what he found. He was not the only one who came that morning. Word of the storm's severity had already spread, along with quiet, unspoken assumptions about what a shelter cut into a hillside might look like after a night like that. 2 neighboring families had lost outbuildings. The Hendricks house, 2 miles off, had frost formed on the inside of every window facing north. What Hollis found instead was a door with no snow drifted against it, a wall warm enough to make him pull his hand back the first time he touched it, and behind that door, a woman and a boy who were not merely alive, but rested. He did not ask her how. Not yet. He simply stood there a while, the way a man stands when he is revising something he had believed for a very long time. Word of that morning moved through the valley faster than the storm itself had. By the following week, 3 separate neighbors had come to see the shelter for themselves, not to mock it, but to ask, plainly, how a hillside everyone had once called a tomb had outlasted timber houses built by men with twice her resources and half her patience. Ruth answered each of them the same way. She did not claim to have invented anything. She told them about Ivar Solberg, about a drainage channel that owed nothing to guesswork, about a vent placed low and high the way families in his home country had done for generations before either of them were born. She told them about the crack, the frost, the wrong angle of wind that had nearly undone all of it in a single night, and the strip of hide that had, by more patience than certainty, held the line. Garrett Calloway did not come to see it himself for another 2 weeks. When he finally did, he did not mention the letter of concern he had once threatened to bring before the county. He stood near the entrance for a while, much as Hollis had, and eventually asked quietly whether Ruth would be willing to help him improve the drainage on his own property before the next hard rain came through. She said yes, without hesitation, and without bringing up everything he had once said about a woman and her sick son living somewhere no proper family should. By the following autumn, 2 other households in the valley had cut similar channels above their own root cellars and outbuildings, angled the way Ivar had first described to a widow with nothing left to lose but her son's next winter. Ivar himself passed 2 years later, quietly, at home, and it was Ruth who spoke at the small gathering afterward, describing not a method, but a kind of patience that had outlived him. The hillside is still there. Later owners widened the entrance further and added a proper door, but the drainage channel above it runs along nearly the same line Ruth first marked with a row of stones, and the vents still sit low and high, exactly as a man from Norway once explained them to a woman who was willing to listen. The wall had never needed to be beautiful. It only needed to be patient. And in the worst winter, in 52 years, patience turned out to be enough. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.